So, Jon, can you tell us what you do at Pulitzer and what you think journalists should do who are looking for money these days?
Sure. Well, thank you, Larry. And Peggy, Mark, and John, it's an honor to be in such excellent company here. First, just a little bit of history. Journalism, from my experience, isn't the best preparation for raising money. You're trained to be skeptical, you're hypersensitive to potential conflicts of interest, and you don't want anyone dictating the spin of your reporting or how you do your work. On the other hand, if you can demonstrate that your independence is real and that you're committed to follow a story wherever it leads, you will find supporters, individuals and foundations who will support you for precisely those reasons. Those are the lessons that I've learned in the 15 years that I've been involved with the Pulitzer Center. And I want to talk a bit about our response to the COVID moment, about how we and similar organizations can support your work. But first, a bit about how we built the Pulitzer Center in terms of raising money to make something happen into what it is today. And as Larry noted, my background is 30 years at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, most of them in the DC Bureau. The entire time I was there, we complained about stringent budgets, lamenting how we'd missed the golden era of journalism. But during those years, the newspaper let me do 25 enterprise reporting projects with months of field work on each of them, taking me around the US and to more than 80 countries across the globe. The DC Bureau I ran had 7 reporters, all of us focused on reporting for just one regional newspaper. That world is dead, as you know. In 2005, the Pulitzer family, owners of the Post-Dispatch since 1879, sold it. I went to Emmy Pulitzer, the chair, and asked for seed money to start a nonprofit aimed at filling gaps in coverage of systemic global issues. She and David Moore, another Pulitzer family member, agreed to stake me to a relatively modest seed fund grant, $1.2 million over 4 years, to see what I could do. They made it very plain that they weren't interested in a vanity project, that if this was to succeed, I would need to raise the bulk of the money, bulk of the funds from other individuals and foundations. And with the help of an incredibly talented staff, we've been building the center ever since, and growing from an annual budget of $335,000 that first year to the current total of around $6 million, and from 9 projects that first year to nearly 200 in 2019, 150 of them with professional journalists across the globe, and another 43 with undergraduate and graduate students at the 38 universities and community colleges that support our work via the Campus Consortium. We've also built an ambitious K-12 education program, writing online curricula based on our journalism that is freely available to schools across the globe. We've worked with hundreds of schools to engage with global issues, making our journalists available in person or via Skype or Zoom, and leading professional development workshops for teachers across the country. We put that education network to use most successfully and most recently as education partner for the New York Times on the 1619 Project, taking that landmark work on slavery's role in American history to nearly 4,000 schools in every state. The Pulitzer family continues as core supporters of the center, but today more than 80% of our operating funds come from non-family members. Individual contributors, big and small, and foundations that include Humanity United, Luce, Rockefeller, Arnold Ventures, and the Omidyar Network. The MacArthur Foundation has been an exceptionally important donor, especially during the past 5 years, through general operating support. And as John knows, the MacArthur program has been a leader nationally in pressing the case for gen op support for successful nonprofit journalism organizations. We are so grateful to Kathy M., Lauren Pabst, and all your colleagues at MacArthur for your leadership on this issue. It's the preponderance of gen op support that made it possible for us to respond as quickly as we did to the unique challenges presented by the coronavirus. And what we did a month ago, Marina Walker Guevara, our executive editor, had the idea of doing a call for proposals on collaborative reporting projects on COVID-19. And partly because, typically our model had been, we would give travel support so that journalist X could go to country Y to report project Z. And suddenly the flights were all shut down. Nobody could travel anywhere. It was dangerous to go lots of places for the reporters and for the people they were covering. And so suddenly we got interested in what could we do drawing on reporting resources in the countries that were already in the places that we wanted to report on. And we'd done a number of projects with the Associated Press, and they came to us with an idea to do something where they would report on global inequities, how the most vulnerable in the world were affected by the coronavirus phenomenon that we're facing. And we agreed to a large grant for the Associated Press to support that year-long project, knowing that they could draw on resources on the reporters who were based all over the country and all over the world. And then we took that idea and we applied it to the general call. And that went out maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. We have gotten nearly 300 proposals from all over the world, requesting in excess of $4 million and some spectacular collaborations. We've approved 25 of them so far, roughly 25, and it's everything from PBS NewsHour to Frontline to a collaborative project with 22 news organizations in North Carolina to cross-border investigative reporting projects in Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. And it's astounding to us what a demonstration of the need that is, but also the opportunity and the willingness of people to think way outside the box and work in collaboration with other news organizations, other countries, with educational institutions. We're doing one project with the Baltimore Sun where the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health is one of our university partners. And so we had a great reporting fellow, a graduate this year of the Hopkins Public Health Program. And we put her together with a great enterprise editor, Diana Sugg at the Baltimore Sun, to do a COVID project in Baltimore. And the Sun, like every other newspaper, is stripped of staff resources. And so Isabel Gomes, the reporting fellow, will come in and be a reporter that we'll fund, and they'll do the project and draw on the great editorial support that she'll get from the Sun and the platform of the Sun on a story that's important to Baltimore. We're doing similar initiatives with Columbia University. The Columbia asked us to administer a $50,000 fund they created to give reporting opportunities to their graduates this spring. And what you're seeing across the country is, particularly for the new group of journalism school graduates, is the disappearance of all the internship opportunities they thought they were going to have at news outlets. The Globe has stopped theirs. I mean, NPR has cut their program way back. This is happening everywhere, and we're trying to fill the gap in that. And the goal is that students from Columbia can apply to us. We will mentor them, we'll match them with our professional journalists around the world, hopefully come up with projects that will be meaningful and that will help get them through this period of time until we get back to something more like normal. And we're doing similar initiatives with the University of Southern California, supporting students there to work with the LA Times on a massive research project into every COVID death in California, and then a project with Stanford, University of Maryland, Arizona State University, and University of Oregon, using students to work on homelessness and COVID. So we feel that the kinds of networks that we've established across media outlets and with donors, and then with the educational institutions that we had to work with, that creates a very virtuous cycle where we can all help each other and create projects that are much more impactful and cost effective than any of us could do on our own.
Jon,
Happy to talk more about how our own application process works. We review proposals every week on COVID and anything else, and so If you don't know about the site, look at pulitzercenter.org, and you'll see that the application process is straightforward and I hope simple, and we look forward to your question.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, to all of the speakers today, and to Larry and Jesse, of course. I'm the news director at the NPR station in the Ozarks region of southern Missouri. And over time, our news staff, like many others, has dwindled. And I've been in this position a couple of years. And I have some, really big ideas to build that with full-time staff coming on board. My question is, these grants sound amazing, and you'll all four probably be hearing from me very soon. But my question is, how do I convert that grant money, which is finite, into a sustainable long-term position here at our station?
Jen, I can take a crack at that. I mean, we are focused on sort of enterprise reporting projects, and that's not long-term sustained support. But our theory of change on this, and I think the NPR, the public radio, is absolutely central to this, because I think what's happened with NPR over the last 4 decades is that you have built a community of support. You have a core audience that many local newspapers no longer have, and you're able to build from that. So we think the future is in building up the connection between organizations like yours and the community. And we focused on the enterprise reporting projects, because we think if we do sort of a signature project that reminds people why it's so important to have that community journalism asset, that it will help you build community support, bring in the community foundations, get people to subscribe, to reconnect with the news organizations that have lost connections with their local community. And it's not something that's going to solve it in a month or a year, but we think over time it can. We had the Bringing Stories Home initiative that we started. We got an endowment gift from Facebook a couple of years ago, and like $5 million that went into our endowment, and the revenue from that we said we would use to build sustained relationships with news organizations across the country and non-national news centers. And we've done, I think, 50 plus projects so far, and each of them it's an enterprise project plus an equal amount of support from us, $10,000, $15,000 per project in outreach. So we can go out to high schools, community colleges, community fora to get people engaged in what the local news organization have done. And we think that's part of this rebuilding, reconnecting task that all of us have. So if it's not the only solution to your problem in terms of staffing and building the staff, but I hope it'll be a part of your solution, and you'll look at that part of our site and give us a proposal, give us something that we can do. I'm always partial to Missouri projects, so come to us with one. We'd love to work together.
I'm cautious, particularly as a board member, not to commit a staff also in public for any grant. I would say certainly the Knight Foundation's Media Learning Seminar, if that's not something that you have all been to, which is typically in February in Miami, which tends to be an appealing destination, is a venue where you would both meet a number of funders, including Knight and MacArthur staff are typically there, but also lots of people asking just the same question. And then for Knight Foundation, as you probably know, the history of it, it was the Knight brothers, Jack and Jim Knight's funding that then supported the foundation. Initially founded a lot of chairs at journalism schools. This was when seemed like all journalists were flush, so we were funding universities at that point. So a number of those Knight chairs are focused on these questions of sustainability, and that's a lot of that learning is at that seminar. In terms of the grant making, Larry, it is every year. There's it is a core part of what Knight gives out, which is $100-something million a year in total. Roughly maybe a third of it is typically to journalism. The most recent commitment to do $300 million over 5 years doubles that. So it's going from about $30 million a year to about $60 million a year. A number of, you can see those grants that we've made so far. Some of them are for things like the American Journalism Project, and others that are kind of hybrids of various sorts, venture funded and otherwise. And many of them looking at these questions of sustainability. so I certainly urge you to check out the Knight Foundation site if you need a connection there. I'm happy to do that. Again, I can't give grants over webinars, but definitely Knight Foundation, I think, is one of the big donors. It is going back to something I think it was Peggy said earlier, for the largest of the national foundations, I think it's harder to do. Well, there's a focus on local news for sure at Knight, but there are, say it's the nicest way possible, there is far too much need in lots and lots and lots of local projects to be able to support it all. And so that's partly why what Knight has done is given money to community foundations in 26 different communities around the country so that that local grant making can happen. So I say that only with caution, which is to say, if each of the NPR affiliates around the country were looking for sustainable funding, Knight doesn't have enough money to do that, but is trying to give money at a national level that then helps sort of answer some of these sustainability questions. Anyway, you get the gist of it.
If anybody wants to take it, or if you think this is a ridiculous question, you can not answer it. If we were to look around at what has rescued some key newspapers around the country over the last 10 years, we would say it's billionaires buying them. And whether it is in Washington or Boston or LA, the old model of rich people giving back to a community is there any way that any of your foundations or any others you've ever thought of have tried to actually get a campaign going to have wealthy people in their communities bail out newspapers that are owned by chains that are killing them or that are just going under?
And do you really want that?
And do you really want that? And Rick Burke, you're a master at having seen John Henry create and build what you've got going there, and then trying to make it into an economically sustainable model. What do you think about the billionaire buys things?
Well, if that were the answer, I wouldn't be on this call, because like I'm looking for how to get more revenue. No, I think,
Can you tell us, by the way, just...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Rick Burke. I'm the editor of Stat, which is a site based in Boston, owned by the owner of the Boston Globe, to cover health and medicine. We're based here, but we have we're national in scope, and we're separate from the Globe, and we're for profit. At least that's our goal, is to be for profit. I think, let me just say, I think this call and these speakers, you're all very encouraging, because at a time when we're all going through this crisis, not only the health crisis, but in journalism, it's nice to see that there are all these efforts being made and all these opportunities out there, many more than I ever imagined. So it's great to hear that. In terms of what you're saying, Larry, about billionaires, I think we should be creative in any way possible to at this time in our history to get funding. And I think funding from rich people does carry can be strings attached, and you have to go in there carefully. But I think it can work, and I think Boston, from my own experience, is a good example where you have the Boston Globe. Our owner owns the Red Sox, and there's stories about the Red Sox that he can't stand, and he doesn't do anything about it because he doesn't want to interfere. So I think there's some good models there of in local communities of getting people to pitch in and help. But can I ask a question about a more self-interested question, or should we wait?
Sure.
And my question isn't. John had talked about the default of funders to go to a nonprofit, and I understand that, but I just would love some advice in my case and for other profit seeking enterprises, where in our case we decided at the very outset to make all our COVID coverage free as a public service. That doesn't help us with the bottom line, and that's why I'm looking for revenue sources. So so I'd love to hear any kind of advice on how a small or any for-profit news organization may find a way to get revenue to encourage and bolster our COVID coverage. Thoughts?
So Rick, I mean, I think you probably know that the Pulitzer Center, we're open to applications from organizations, for-profit and nonprofit, freelancers and staff.
Right.
It's wide open.
Right.
Great. John Pulfer, you had.
Rick, I think it's a great thing to have done to make the coverage free, and I applaud all those organizations that have it. Seems totally right, and to Mark's point, and what John's saying, I think it does help a ton with that question. You know, in the simplest form, again, I think this is sort of an historical trend that we are part of, which is it was once that these newspapers were the sources of the capital that we are now giving away. So McCormick Foundation and Knight Foundation as two specific examples. So I think we've just been accustomed to the fact that the big newspapers are the ones that have had the money, not the ones who are seeking it. So there's that cognitive dissonance. I think the billionaire one is very important. So just sitting with staff at a foundation or with trustees to say, you know, the Henrys are a wonderful family, are doing great things. If we give money to a for-profit that they own, it's hard for people to get over the fact that they're giving money to something that is owned by billionaires. That is a cognitive challenge, and it's one that you and the Globe have, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That is not to say it can't happen, and I do think that the right way to do it is to carve off something and say this is clearly a public service. It's being done, you know, in a way that ought to be supported. And again, though foundations aren't easily all set up for it, it's doable. The other piece I would flip to, which was the previous question about, or the broader question about billionaires and papers. Larry, you I think asked a question that probably was directed in large part to me about whether big foundations have been approached about taking over newspapers, and the answer is of course. So both as a trustee at Knight and as president of MacArthur, we have been approached by a number of newspapers. Often it's, you know, rank and file, or it's editors of newspapers saying, would you please buy us out? Would you please do a kind of a takeover? I think there is the question of, would you want that? I don't know the answer to that. Foundations are not, we don't have the skill to do it. So what I've said back when I've been approached about this kind of thing is, we might be able to do it, and we might be able to take our balance sheet, particularly if it's an asset that's not particularly expensive to buy. It's still expensive to run, but the next question though is the question of execution risk. So we wouldn't be able to run a big newspaper in the city of Chicago or Boston or wherever it might be. That would have to be the journalistic field, and I think that part of that would need to be a broader and more kind of coherent effort to try to do a newspaper that is not for profit at some scale. Obviously, you have the Philadelphia experiment. That's one that Knight, along with Lenfest and others, have been trying to help succeed. There are, hybrids in a couple different places. So I do think that that's something that's going to happen. My prediction is that more journalistic organizations will fail in the next 3 to 5 years, perhaps prompted by COVID. We will be asking, I think, Larry's question, should nonprofits or community organizations or otherwise, buy the paper of record in City X? And the answer may be yes, and here's how to restructure it and to bring it up. But it's going to require those in the field of journalism to be, ones who are going to run them on nonprofit bases if we go down that road. So anyway, I think it's a longer and different conversation than how you fund your COVID coverage, but I don't think they're unrelated, particularly when you get to those that are owned by billionaires, because I think you still have to negotiate that.
Rick, expanding on that, instead of the billionaire model, I'd love to see the Green Bay Packer model, where the community owns the paper and has shares in it, much like you're talking about, Rick. And I don't know the dimensions of the Save Chicago media effort, but truly every community could be doing a Save Our Media effort. And it would be interesting to me if anyone has seen a Green Bay Packer model for a newspaper, a radio station, TV station in their community.
Peggy, couldn't a foundation underwrite that model to try to gin it up in a community like Chicago? Yes,
I think they could. And I think it would be a worthwhile one to start. I've always been amazed why there haven't been more sort of Green Bay Packer-like efforts in many fields, but I think journalism and newspapers in particular would be a really wise way to have that go forward.
If I could add just one cautionary note on that, I'd be wary of thinking that either a billionaire or a community, a Green Bay Packers type approach could save big legacy news outlets like the Tribune, or you name it, or across the country that, you know, are saddled with huge debts and union cost, all the other things that are associated with it. That I remember when the Pulitzers were going to sell the Post-Dispatch, I tried to persuade Emmy Pulitzer to let us do an employee stock purchase, and all I needed was for her to take the $600 million that what her value of her holdings were, and be so-called quiet capital, and to stay in, accept like a 1% return, and then we could borrow money. And then 6 of us on the editorial side, we actually had a conversation with investment bankers. We got a Cleveland bank that was prepared to give us $900 million for us to buy the Post-Dispatch if Emmy kept her money in. And had we done that, we could have bought the Post-Dispatch, and then we would have spent the next 10 years firing all of our friends at the Post-Dispatch, and which is what Lee Enterprises, which ultimately Emmy said, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. She went with the sale. It was sold to Lee Enterprises. What they bought for $1.6 billion is today valued at like $100 million. So they lost 95 cents on every dollar they invested, and the paper was stripped of its reporting assets. So I was talking we were saying to Jen earlier about the community radio model, and sort of building on where you've already got a kind of community structure, and thinking about all of these 200 odd startups through INN, the Institute of Nonprofit News. I mean, there's a lot of energy out there that has no legacy cost. And in my view, you build that up, and you work on relationships, partnerships with local educational institutions, K-12 and college. They're also here to stay. They've got it, and they're looking for content. They're looking for engagement. They want their students to be engaged. I think there's a much more potential to rebuild the kind of community engagement and respect for journalism on that side than there is in pouring money into trying to prop up what may be the walking dead and a lot of these old legacy outlets. I think we just have to face up to that.
Just wanted to hear a little bit about this particular time with ideas that journalists might have for these grants and funding that you all have been talking about. How prominent do you think COVID needs to be in those ideas, or do people need to shift, maybe something that they've already had an idea about and incorporate coronavirus or this particular time? How are funders looking at that right now?
Elizabeth, I'd say the same in terms of MacArthur's thinking, which is certainly there are funds that we are putting out right now, whether they're through the various partnerships I mentioned or specifically around COVID, and that's, we all should be, all hands on deck, obviously, and we are dipping deeper into our funds than we ordinarily would to do that. But we also are involved in the long game, and I guess I might push back a tiny bit on Charles Kravitz's note that funders aren't, well coordinated in a big, longer push, because I actually think there's a fair amount of work thinking about that. There's certainly not enough funding. There's not enough of a push in that way. But I do think that staying the course in terms of trying to support, and I point to the $300 million the Knights put out, as well as of others, trying to work on these longer term issues. And whatever your longer term issue is, I think that's important for you to be continuing to propose, because I think if we took all of our money right now, yanked it out of supporting getting more journalists of color covering communities of color, or we stopped supporting NPR, or we stopped supporting the kinds of Pulitzers and the kinds of organizations we have historically done, I think that would be, again, sort of pulling the rug out under the longer term efforts at exactly the wrong time. So bring both, noting that I think Mark's point is good, that certain COVID things are going to get handled more quickly, but I would absolutely continue that long game and seek to be as coordinated as we can in our efforts to serve democracy in a long-term sense.
I don't actually see a distinction. I think that COVID is changing the world in fundamental and highly disruptive ways, and it's going to affect everything from how we work and where we live, and the service industries and the arts and cultural and sports industries that will be affected long-term by this, to migration, to refugees, to immigration policy, all of the things that we thought of before as non-COVID, they are going to be things that we need to work on. We're going to be working on them for not just months, but years to come. So I don't think there's going to be a problem in terms of looking for it as either COVID or not COVID. They all are going to come together.